We are all in it together. Don't you love people? We'll never go back to normal unless we all get the COVID vaccine. It's safe and effective. You want to go back to normal, don't you? Are you afraid? There is nothing to be afraid of if you trust the science. Don't take the vaccine if you are worried about the following list of adverse events of special interest.
1p36 deletion syndrome, 2-hydroxyglutaric aciduria, 5-nucleotidase increased, acoustic neuritis, acquired C1 inhibitor deficiency, acquired epidermolysis bullosa, acquired epileptic aphasia, acute cutaneous lupus erythematosus, acute disseminated encephalomyelitis, acute encephalitis with refractory, repetitive partial seizures, acute febrile neutrophilic dermatoses, acute flaccid myelitis, acute hemorrhagic leukoencephalitis, acute hemorrhagic edema of infancy, acute kidney injury, acute macular outer retinopathy, acute motor axonal neuropathy, acute motor sensory axonal neuropathy, acute myocardial infarction, acute respiratory distress syndrome, acute respiratory failure, Addison's disease, administration site thrombosis, administration site vasculitis, adrenal thrombosis, adverse event following immunization, agusia, agranulocytosis, ear embolism, alanine aminotransferase abnormal, alanine aminotransferase increased, alcoholic seizure, allergic bronchopulmonary mycosis, allergic edema. Alloimmune hepatitis, alopecia areata, Alpers disease, alveolar proteinosis, ammonia abnormal, ammonia increased, amniotic cavity infection, amygdalohippocampeectomy, amyloid arthropathy, amyloidosis senile, anaphylactic reaction, anaphylactic shock, anaphylactic transfusion reaction, anaphylactoid shock, anaphylactoid syndrome of pregnancy, angioedema, angiopathic neuropathy, ankylosing spondylitis, anosmia, anti-acetylcholine receptor antibody positive, anti-actin antibody positive, anti-aquaporin 4 antibody positive, anti-basal ganglia antibody positive, anti-cyclic citrullonated peptide antibody positive, anti-epithelial antibody positive, anti-erythrocyte antibody positive, anti-exosome complex antibody positive, anti-GAD antibody negative, anti-GAD antibody positive, anti-ganglioside antibody positive, anti-gliadin antibody positive, anti-glomerular basement membrane antibody positive, anti-glomerular basement membrane disease, anti-GLYCY ultranasynthetase antibody positive, anti-HLA antibody test positive, anti-IA2 antibody positive, anti-insulin antibody increased, anti-insulin antibody positive, anti-insulin receptor antibody increased, anti-insulin receptor antibody positive, anti-interferon antibody negative, anti-interferon antibody positive, anti-islet cell antibody positive, anti-mitochondrial antibody positive, anti-muscle specific kinase antibody positive, anti-myelin associated glycoprotein antibodies positive, anti-myelin associated glycoprotein associated polyneuropathy, anti-myocardial antibody positive, anti-neuronal antibody positive, anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody increased, anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody positive, anti-neutrophil cytoplasmic antibody positive vasculitis, anti-NMDA antibody positive, anti-nuclear antibody increased, anti-nuclear antibody positive, anti-phospholipid antibodies positive, anti-phospholipid syndrome, anti-platelet antibody positive, anti-prothrombin antibody positive, anti-ribosomal P antibody positive, anti-RNA polymerase 3 antibody positive, anti-Saccharomyces cerevisiae antibody test positive, anti-sperm antibody positive, anti-SRP antibody positive, anti-synthetase syndrome, anti-thyroid antibody positive, anti-transglutaminase antibody increased, anti-BGCC antibody positive, anti-BGKC antibody positive, anti-vimentin antibody positive, antiviral prophylaxis, antiviral treatment, anti-zinc transporter 8 antibody positive, aortic embolus, aortic thrombosis, aortitis, aplasia pure red cell, aplastic anemia, application site thrombosis, application site vasculitis, arrhythmia, arterial bypass occlusion, arterial bypass thrombosis, arterial thrombosis, arteriovenous fistula thrombosis, arteriovenous graft site stenosis, arteriovenous graft thrombosis, arteritis coronary, arthralgia, arthritis enteropathic, ascites, aseptic cavernous sinus thrombosis, aspartate aminotransferase abnormal, aspartate aminotransferase increased, aspartate glutamate transporter deficiency, AST to platelet ratio index increased, AST/ALT ratio abnormal, asthma, asymptomatic COVID-19. Ataxia, atheroembolism, atonic seizures, atrial thrombosis, atrophic thyroiditis, atypical benign partial epilepsy, atypical pneumonia, aura, autoantibody positive, autoimmune anemia, autoimmune aplastic anemia, autoimmune arthritis, autoimmune blistering disease, autoimmune cholangitis, autoimmune colitis, autoimmune demyelinating disease, autoimmune dermatitis, autoimmune disorder, autoimmune encephalopathy, autoimmune endocrine disorder, autoimmune enteropathy, autoimmune eye disorder, autoimmune hemolytic anemia, autoimmune heparin-induced thrombocytopenia, autoimmune hepatitis, autoimmune hyperlipidemia, autoimmune hypothyroidism, autoimmune inner ear disease, autoimmune lung disease, autoimmune lymphoproliferative syndrome, autoimmune myocarditis, autoimmune myositis, autoimmune nephritis, autoimmune neuropathy, autoimmune neutropenia, autoimmune pancreatitis, autoimmune pancytopenia, autoimmune pericarditis, autoimmune retinopathy, autoimmune thyroid disorder, autoimmune thyroiditis, autoimmune uveitis, autoinflammation with infantile enterocolitis, autoinflammatory disease, automatism epileptic, autonomic nervous system imbalance, autonomic seizure, axial spondyloarthritis, axillary vein thrombosis, axonal and demyelinating polyneuropathy, axonal neuropathy, bacterocytes, Baltic myoclonic epilepsy, band sensation, Basedow disease, basilar artery thrombosis, basicallopenia, B-cell aplasia, Bess's syndrome, benign ethnic neutropenia, benign familial neonatal convulsions, benign familial pemphigus, benign rolandic epilepsy, beta-2 glycoprotein antibody positive, Bickerstaff's encephalitis, bile output abnormal, bile output decreased, biliary ascites, bilirubin conjugated abnormal, bilirubin conjugated increased, bilirubin urine present, biopsy liver abnormal, biotinidase deficiency, birdshot choroidal retinopathy, blood alkaline phosphatase abnormal, blood alkaline phosphatase increased, blood bilirubin abnormal, blood bilirubin increased, blood bilirubin unconjugated increased, blood cholinesterase abnormal, blood cholinesterase decreased, blood pressure decreased, blood pressure diastolic decreased, blood pressure systolic decreased, Bluetooth syndrome, brachiocephalic vein thrombosis, brainstem embolism, brainstem thrombosis, Romas alveoli test abnormal, bronchial edema, bronchitis, bronchitis mycoplasmal, bronchitis viral, bronchopulmonary aspergillosis allergic, bronchospasm, Budd-Chiari syndrome, Bulbar palsy, butterfly rash, C1q nephropathy, cesarean section, calcium embolism, Kaplan-Meier Kaplan syndrome, cardiac amyloidosis, cardiac arrest, cardiac failure acute, cardiac sarcoidosis, cardiac ventricular thrombosis, cardiogenic shock, cardiolipin antibody positive, cardiopulmonary carotid artery thrombosis, cataplexy, catheter side thrombosis, catheter side vasculitis, cavernous sinus thrombosis, CDKL5 deficiency disorder, CEC syndrome, cement embolism, central nervous system lupus, central nervous system, vasculitis, cerebellar artery thrombosis, cerebellar embolism, cerebral amyloid angiopathy, cerebral arteritis, cerebral artery embolism, cerebral artery thrombosis, cerebral gas embolism, cerebral microembolism, cerebral septic infarct, cerebral thrombosis, cerebral venous sinus thrombosis, cerebral venous thrombosis, cerebrospinal thrombotic tamponade, cerebrovascular accident, change in seizure presentation, chest discomfort, child Buter-Cott score abnormal, child Buter-Cott score increased, chilblains, choking. Choking sensation, cholangitis sclerosing, chronic autoimmune glomerulonephritis, chronic cutaneous lupus erythematosus, chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic gastritis, chronic inflammatory demyelinating polyradiculoneuropathy, chronic lymphocytic inflammation with pontine perivascular enhancement responsive to steroids, chronic recurrent multifocal osteomyelitis, chronic respiratory failure, chronic spontaneous urticaria, circulatory collapse, circumoral edema, circumoral swelling, clinically isolated. Syndrome, clonic convulsion. Coeliac disease, Cogan syndrome, cold agglutinin positive, cold type hemolytic anemia, colitis, colitis erosive, colitis herpes, colitis microscopic, colitis ulcerative, collagen disorder, collagen vascular disease, complement factor abnormal, complement factor C1 decreased, complement factor C2 decreased, complement factor C3 decreased, complement factor C4 decreased, complement factor decreased, computerized tomogram liver abnormal, concentric sclerosis, congenital anomaly, congenital bilateral perisylvian. Syndrome, congenital herpes simplex infection, congenital myasthenic syndrome, congenital varicella infection, congestive hepatopathy, convulsion in childhood, convulsions local, convulsive threshold lowered, Coombs positive hemolytic anemia, coronary artery disease, coronary artery embolism, coronary artery thrombosis, coronary bypass thrombosis, coronavirus infection, coronavirus test negative, coronavirus test positive, corpus callosodomy, cough variant asthma, COVID-19, immunization, COVID-19 pneumonia. COVID-19 prophylaxis, COVID-19 treatment, cranial nerve disorder, cranial nerve palsies multiple, cranial nerve paralysis, Crest syndrome, Crohn's disease, cryofibronegenemia, cryoglobulinemia, CSF oligoclonal band present, CSWS syndrome, cutaneous amyloidosis, cutaneous lupus erythematosus, cutaneous sarcoidosis, cutaneous vasculitis, cyanosis, cyclic neutropenia, cystitis interstitial, cytokine release syndrome, cytokine storm, de novo purine synthesis inhibitors associated acute inflammatory syndrome, death. Neonatal, deep vein thrombosis postoperative, deficiency of bile secretion, deja vu, demyelinating polyneuropathy, demyelination, dermatitis bullous, dermatitis herpetiformis, dermatomyositis, device embolization, device-related thrombosis, diabetes mellitus, diabetic ketoacidosis, diabetic mastopathy, dialysis amyloidosis, dialysis membrane reaction, diastolic hypotension, diffuse vasculitis, digital pitting scar, disseminated intravascular coagulation, coagulation in newborn. Disseminated neonatal herpes simplex, disseminated varicella zoster vaccine virus infection, disseminated varicella zoster virus infection, DNA antibody positive, double cortex syndrome, double-stranded DNA antibody positive, dreamy state, Dressler syndrome, drop attacks, drug withdrawal convulsions, dyspnoea, early infantile epileptic encephalopathy with burst suppression, eclampsia, eczema herpeticum, emboli cutis medicamentosa, embolic cerebellar infarction, embolic cerebral. Infarction, embolic pneumonia, embolic stroke, embolism arterial, embolism venous, encephalitis allergic, encephalitis autoimmune, encephalitis brainstem, encephalitis hemorrhagic, encephalitis periaxialis diffusa, encephalitis post-immunization, encephalomyelitis, encephalopathy, endocrine disorder, endocrine ophthalmopathy, endotracheal intubason, entrypes leukopenic, enterobacter pneumonia, enterocolitis, enteropathic spondylitis, eosinopenia, eosinophilic fasciitis, eosinophilic granulomatosis with polyangiitis, eosinophilic esophagitis, epidermolysis, epilepsy surgery, epilepsy with myoclonic atonic seizures, epileptic aura, epileptic psychosis, erythema induratum, erythema multiforme, erythema nodosum, Evans syndrome, exanthema subidum, expanded disability status scale score decreased, expanded disability status scale score increased, exposure to communicable disease, exposure to SARS-CoV-2, eye edema, hyperitis, eye swelling, eyelid edema, face edema, facial paralysis, facial paresis, faciobrachial dystonic seizure, fat embolism, febrile convulsion, febrile infection-related epilepsy syndrome, febrile neutropenia, Velvey syndrome, femoral artery embolism, fibrillary glomerulonephritis, fibromyalgia, flushing, foaming at mouth, focal cortical resection, focal dyscognitive seizures, fetal distress syndrome, fetal placental thrombosis, fetor hepaticus, foreign body embolism, frontal lobe epilepsy, fulminant type 1 diabetes mellitus, galactose elimination. Capacity test abnormal. Galactose elimination capacity test decreased. Gamma-glutamyl abnormal. Gamma-glutamyl increased. Gastritis herpes. Gastrointestinal amyloidosis. Gelastic seizure. General east onset non-motor seizure. General east tonic-clonic seizure. Genital herpes simplex. Genital herpes zoster. Giant cell arteritis. Glomerulonephritis. Glomerulonephritis membranoproliferative. Glomerulonephritis membranous. Glomerulonephritis rapidly progressive. Glossopharyngeal nerve paralysis. Glucose. Transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome. Glutamate dehydrogenase increased. Glycocholic acid increased. GM2 gangliosidosis. Goodpasture syndrome. Graft thrombosis. Granulocytopenia neonatal. Granulomatosis with polyangiitis. Granulomatous dermatitis. Gray matter heterotopia. 1-ACE increased. DDAPR syndrome. Hemolytic anemia. Hemophagocytic lymphohistiocytosis. Hemorrhagic ascites. Hemorrhagic disorder. Hemorrhagic pneumonia. Hemorrhagic varicella syndrome. Hemorrhagic vasculitis. Antivirus pulmonary infection. Hashimoto's encephalopathy. Hashitic psychosis. Hemimegalencephaly. Enox-conline purpura. Enox-Schonlein purpura nephritis. Hepaplastin abnormal. Hepaplastin decreased. Heparin-induced thrombocytopenia. Hepatic amyloidosis. Hepatic artery embolism. Hepatic artery flow decreased. Hepatic artery thrombosis. Hepatic enzyme abnormal. Hepatic enzyme decreased. Hepatic enzyme increased. Hepatic fibrosis marker abnormal. Hepatic fibrosis marker increased. Hepatic function abnormal. Hepatic hydrothorax, hepatic hypertrophy, hepatic hypoperfusion, hepatic lymphocytic infiltration, hepatic mass, hepatic pain, hepatic sequestration, hepatic vascular resistance increased, hepatic vascular thrombosis, hepatic vein embolism, hepatic vein thrombosis, hepatic venous pressure gradient abnormal, hepatic venous pressure gradient increased, hepatitis, hepatobiliary scan abnormal, hepatomegaly, hyperosplenomegaly, hereditary angioedema with C1 esterase inhibitor deficiency, herpes dermatitis, herpes gestationis, herpes esophagitis, herpes ophthalmic, herpes pharyngitis, herpes sepsis, herpes simplex cervicides, herpes simplex colitis, herpes simplex encephalitis, herpes simplex gastritis, herpes simplex hepatitis, herpes simplex meningitis, herpes simplex meningoencephalitis, herpes simplex meningomyelitis, herpes simplex necrotizing retinopathy, herpes simplex esophagitis, herpes simplex otitis externa, herpes simplex pharyngitis, herpes simplex pneumonia, herpes simplex reactivation, herpes simplex sepsis, herpes simplex viremia, herpes simplex virus conjunctivitis neonatal, herpes simplex visceral, herpes virus infection, herpes zoster cutaneous disseminated, herpes zoster infection neurological, herpes zoster meningitis, herpes zoster meningoencephalitis, herpes zoster meningomyelitis, herpes zoster meningocorticulitis, herpes zoster necrotizing retinopathy, herpes zoster oticus, herpes zoster pharyngitis, herpes zoster reactivation, herpetic reticulopathy, histone antibody positive, Point syndrome, human. Herpes virus 6 encephalitis. Human herpes virus 6 infection. Human herpes virus 6 infection reactivation. Human herpes virus 7 infection. Human herpes virus 8 infection. Hyperammonemia. Hyperbilirubinemia. Hypercholia. Hypergammaglobulinemia benign monoclonal. Hyperglycemic seizure. Hypersensitivity. Hypersensitivity vasculitis. Hyperthyroidism. Hypertransaminasemia. Hyperventilation. Hypoalbuminemia. Hypocalcemic seizure. Hypogammaglobulinemia. Hypoglossal nerve paralysis. Hypoglossal nerve paresis. Hypoglycemic seizure. Hypoatremic seizure. Hypotension. Hypotensive crisis. Hypophenarhammer syndrome. Hypothyroidism. Hypoxia. Idiopathic CD4 lymphocytopenia. Idiopathic general epilepsy. Idiopathic interstitial pneumonia. Idiopathic neutropenia. Idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis. IgA nephropathy. IgM nephropathy. IIIRD nerve paralysis. IIIRD nerve paresis. Iliac artery embolism. Immune thrombocytopenia. Immune-mediated adverse reaction. Immune-mediated cholangitis. Immune-mediated cholestasis. Immune-mediated cytopenia. Immune-mediated encephalitis. Immune-mediated encephalopathy. Immune-mediated endocrinopathy. Immune-mediated enterocolitis. Immune-mediated gastritis. Immune-mediated hepatic disorder. Immune-mediated hepatitis. Immune-mediated hyperthyroidism. Immune-mediated hypothyroidism. Immune-mediated myocarditis. Immune-mediated myositis. Immune-mediated nephritis. Immune-mediated neuropathy. Immune-mediated pancreatitis. Immune-mediated pneumonitis. Immune-mediated renal disorder. Immune-mediated thyroiditis. Immune-mediated colitis. Immunoglobulin. G4-related disease. Immunoglobulins abnormal. Implantic thrombosis. Inclusion polymyositis. Infantile genetic granulocytosis. Infantile spasms. Infected vasculitis. Infected thrombosis. Inflammation. Inflammatory bowel disease. Infusion site thrombosis. Infusion site vasculitis. Injection site thrombosis. Injection site urticaria. Injection site vasculitis. Insulation site thrombosis. Insulin autoimmune syndrome. Interstitial granulomatous dermatitis. Interstitial lung disease. Intracardiac mass. Intracardiac thrombus. Intracranial pressure increased. Intrapericardial thrombosis. Intrinsic factor antibody abnormal. Intrinsic factor antibody positive. IPEX syndrome. Irregular breathing. Irvin syndrome. IVTH nerve paralysis. IVTH nerve paresis. JC polyomavirus test positive. JC virus CSF test positive. Javon syndrome. Jugular vein embolism. Jugular vein thrombosis. Juvenile idiopathic arthritis. Juvenile myoclonic epilepsy. Juvenile polymyositis. Juvenile psoriatic arthritis. Juvenile spondyloarthritis. Kaposi sarcoma. Inflammatory cytokine syndrome. Kawasaki's disease. Kaiser-Fleischer ring. Keratoderma blenerogica. Ketosis-prone diabetes mellitus. Countess syndrome. Lafort's myoclonic epilepsy. Lamblos excrescences. Laryngeal dysnoia. Laryngeal edema. Laryngeal rheumatoid arthritis. Laryngospasm. Laryngotracheal edema. Latent autoimmune diabetes in adults. LE cells present. Lemierre syndrome. Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. Leucine-aminopeptidase increased. Leukoencephalomyelitis. Leukoencephalopathy. Leukopenia. Leukopenia neonatal. Lewis-Sumner syndrome. Lermid's sign. Lichen planopilaris. Lichen planus. Lichen sclerosis. Limbic encephalitis. Linear IgA disease. Lipedema. Lip swelling. Liver function test abnormal. Liver function test decreased. Liver function test increased. Liver induration. Liver injury. Liver iron concentration abnormal. Liver iron concentration increased. Liver opacity. Liver palpable. Liver sarcoidosis. Liver scan abnormal. Liver tenderness. Low birth weight baby. Lower respiratory tract herpes infection. Lower respiratory tract infection. Lower respiratory tract infection viral. Lung abscess. Lipoid hepatic cirrhosis. Lupus cystitis. Lupus encephalitis. Lupus endocarditis. Lupus erythema. Lupus hepatitis. Lupus myocarditis. Lupus myositis. Lupus nephritis. Lupus pancreatitis. Lupus pleurisy. Lupus pneumonitis. Lupus vasculitis. Lupus-like syndrome. Lymphocytic hypophysitis. Lymphocytopenia neonatal. Lymphopenia. Magic syndrome. Magnetic resonance imaging liver abnormal. Magnetic resonance proton density fat fraction measurement. Mahler sign. Manufacturing laboratory analytical testing issue. Manufacturing materials issue.